Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Levin, for agreeing to meet today to talk about your work and your upcoming work for the summer for the CWI Conference. So first and foremost, just to get started, so you're under contract for a new book on Robert Gould Shaw, tentatively coming out 2024, I believe, if I have that correct.
Hopefully.
Fantastic. And so you'll be speaking about Robert Gould Shaw at this upcoming CWI conference. So first and foremost, congratulations on the new book.
Thanks.
That's very exciting. Congrats on speaking at the CWI conference. And secondly, what was the impetus for writing about this particular individual? What inspired you? What was the moment that jettisoned this project?
Yeah, well, first, thanks, Wesley, for the chance to talk about this, and look forward to meeting you in person in June at CWI.
Absolutely.
So this has been a project that's been in the works for a number of years. I should just sort of be forthright and admit that it's definitely behind schedule, but that's how a lot of these things do progress, these large projects, book projects. I moved to Boston in 2011 from Central Virginia, and up till then, all of my research into the Civil War, even my first two books, were pretty much about the Confederacy and about the South, and that has a lot to do with just my fascination with the history and the broad history of the region. And when I moved to Boston again in 2011, I wanted to at some point latch on to a more regional topic, something more local. And with an interest in historical memory, to me, Robert Gould Shaw was sort of the perfect subject. The last biography of Shaw was written over 20 years ago. Most people, I think, know about Robert Gould Shaw through the Hollywood movie Glory, which came out in 1989. And that movie certainly went far in shaping how people think about and remember Shaw. And I think it's safe to say that for most people, Shaw is, when you think of Robert Gould Shaw, you think immediately the 54th Massachusetts, right? The first Black regiment raised in the North. And that's certainly an important part of his military career. But I was also interested in the broader trajectory of Shaw's military career. He went off to war in the spring of 1861, first with a New York militia unit, and then a few months later with the Second Massachusetts. And he was with the Second Massachusetts through the end of 1862, even into the earliest part of 1863, before he accepted command of the 54th. And so I was really, one of the things I was really interested in digging into was that earlier phase. Getting back to sort of the why of the project, I thought it would also be nice to have the vast majority of the resources that I would need in the Boston area, right? So I wouldn't have to sort of go around, driving, flying to different repositories around the country. And that's turned out to be the case for the most part, but it's always nice to do a little bit of traveling. But it's also nice to be able to have a home base, right? And do the work here. So I'm getting there. It's a delayed project in part because of COVID, but I'm beginning to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Well, fantastic. So how would you say the movie Glory, which so many people know, and that's so many people's frame of reference for Robert Gould Shaw in the 54th, how has that shaped the perception and perhaps misconceptions about both the leader of the regiment, but also the regiment itself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I think what it's done is it's sort of, Shaw has become the, lack of a better way of putting it, the poster boy for what you might call an emancipationist memory of the war. He has, I was reading actually last night a speech by W.E.B. Du Bois from 1906, and he sort of couples Shaw with, Garrison, Douglas, and a whole other, number of John Brown and other abolitionists. And I think Glory sort of, in a way, frames Shaw around that image as sort of the freedom fighter. And I think it does that in part because it does focus overwhelmingly on the last 6 months of his military career with the 54th. I should say, Glory is still one of my favorite Hollywood movies, if not my favorite Hollywood Civil War movie, in part because I think it does a pretty good job of showing some evolution in Shaw's attitude when it comes to, his ideas of race, what the war is about. But as I was saying earlier, it can't quite capture it, completely, because it essentially ignores that earlier phase. And one thing I'm really sort of appreciating about Shaw is that he was very much a work in progress right up until the end of his life. He certainly had evolved in certain ways, regarding his attitudes about race, and again, about what the war is supposedly about. And his parents, of course, provided him with a foundation in terms of activism, reformism. His parents were really one of the leaders first in Boston and then later in the New York area of the abolitionist community. They were heavily involved with a number of reform movements. But Shaw, as I'm finding out, never fully embraced his parents' zeal, reformist zeal and commitments. And even during the war itself, he saw the war as primarily about union, although he never fully or even articulates that idea. He's someone who, I think, like a lot of other young men at the time, was trying to find himself, trying to sort of figure out a path forward that would take him even beyond the war itself. And, obviously the war cut that short. Again, he dies in July of 1863. So on the one hand, Glory does a really good job of, sort of capturing some of that dynamic between the white officers and the black soldiers. But I think it goes a little bit too far in sort of casting Shaw in terms of that sort of emancipationist umbrella, or that narrative. And so I hope the book, I hope the biography sort of allows people to place that last phase of his career within broader historical context, so we can see him as someone sort of maturing as the war progresses, learning as he goes along, making missteps as he goes along, and really just trying to figure things out like a lot of other people were trying to do. I'll just say this, I think his death in the middle of the war also made it very easy for people, especially his own family and specifically his mother, to sort of begin to transform him into this martyr for the cause. We don't know what Shaw's attitudes would have been regarding things like Reconstruction, sort of the post-war racial issues that we all know are looming ahead. And so it becomes much easier to sort of turn him into what we need, right? And again, his mother does this. The African-American community here in Boston does this after the war. And then, of course, we see this later in the 19th century with the dedication of the Shaw Memorial in May of 1897.
Sure, well, that's fascinating. I'd never considered that we don't know what Shaw would have thought about Reconstruction and these later issues that are so central to our current and contemporary thought on the Civil War.
Yeah, there's memory, right? There's that difference between memory and history, right? Which is
Most
just
certainly.
I find fascinating. Yeah,
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So would you say that is the biggest misconception regarding Shaw, and just publicly, or is there something else that you would?
No, I think there are surprises along the way in the story. Couple examples, or one example that occurs more than once. In 1861, and especially I'm trying to think, May of 1862, Shaw did become involved in a plan to raise Black troops. And I think some people will find that to be interesting, given what happens later on in 1863. But there's also a danger, because I think some people might be tempted to think that, they can see a kind of direct connection between these two moments, between what happened, say, in May of 62 and early 1863. He does become sort of involved in an attempt to raise a Black regiment. But what's really interesting about this is, if you read his letters, and we have most of his letters, his wartime letters that he wrote home, he never really dwells on sort of the importance of raising Black soldiers. He references at times, but he drops it as quickly as he raises the issue. And it becomes very difficult as a historian to try to figure out, all right, what does this mean? How committed is he or was he to this project as opposed to 1863? In other words, what I guess I'm getting at here is there's always a danger of reading back into history rather than trying to understand it from the individual's perspective. That just because Shaw does become involved in these projects doesn't mean that he was sort of destined to become the colonel of the 54th. But I think beyond that, I think the biggest misconception is, as I was suggesting, that he saw himself as an abolitionist or as a, somebody sort of committed to Black civil rights. Certainly he believed that slavery was immoral. He shared that with many of his peers. It's important to remember that Shaw spends most of 1861 and 62 in the Shenandoah Valley. And right from the beginning of his experience in the upper Shenandoah Valley, or I should say lower Shenandoah Valley, he is confronted by escaped slaves. And this is a first for him, as it would have been for many of his peers, his fellow officers, and many in the rank and file. And certainly that experience, those confrontations, shaped how he viewed African Americans. He had virtually no contact with Black people before the war. And this is someone who grew up in a house on Beacon Street, a few blocks from the Massachusetts State House, and a few blocks from one of the most vibrant Black communities in the entire country on the north slope of Beacon Hill. But he spent part of his time before the war in Europe studying. He just doesn't have that personal contact, and the war does that for him. And so certainly his understanding of African Americans begins to evolve, and of course the broader issues of slavery. But again, as I suggested earlier, it's he's still a work in progress up until the very end. He's still trying to work out these ideas. And so, that to me is the challenge of writing biography. This is the first time I've tried to write a biography, and I'm finding that's one of the real, that's a tough thing to try to capture. This sense of change over time, and the sense that of contingency, that he just doesn't know how all this is going to play out, as no one did at the time, right? I mean, we have the luxury of having that bird's eye view of things and knowing how things turned out, and Shaw simply didn't, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a biographer's job to try to capture that as much as possible. Absolutely.
What would you say in terms of the historiography on Shaw? Where is the gap? What is it that what gap are you filling?
Yeah,
to bring him into the modern contemporary era of Civil War scholarship?
Yeah, another really good question. As I said earlier, the last biography of Shaw was written, Russell Duncan's book, University of Georgia Press, a really small book. I think it's about 120 pages. It's essentially a little bit longer than the introduction he wrote to his published collection of Shaw letters, which is really just phenomenal, right? It's a wonderful book to have. His original letters, I should say, which are also available online. Harvard has digitized his letters, a beautiful penmanship. And so if you actually want a collection of letters that you can read throughout, right? Shaw's letters are just a real joy. I was going to say, yes. So the gap in the historiography, it's funny you sort of frame it that way. I think you correctly frame it, but it's interesting because in my mind, Shaw has never really, he doesn't have a kind of modern biography. Duncan does a competent job of, this sort of short overview of Shaw's life from roughly 20 years ago. But there are a lot of questions that I think he couldn't address. A lot of what I'm finding interesting that connects to the recent historiography has to do with studies of Union command, especially the politics of command. These were, politics was pervasive throughout the Union Army, especially the Army of the Potomac. And there have been a number of really good studies about that. And Shaw, being in the Shenandoah Valley, experiences a lot of the politics, especially the politics surrounding emancipation, those issues, and trying to figure out, okay, who are the who do you cozy up to in terms of trying to gain promotion? Because in my mind, that is Shaw's primary concern early on. It's how do I advance my own career, right? I mean, he's this young guy, never had been able to sort of figure out what to do in terms of a career path. And the Army is, I think, the first time where he actually feels as if he's competent, that he's in the right place. And so I think a lot of the recent studies about the politics of command, how to understand the dynamic between officers and the rank and file, right? There's this kind of really interesting dynamic that's, you need to understand sort of the antebellum period of notions of democracy, the extent to which the rank and file are willing to follow orders, how the extent to which they see themselves as volunteers. What does the citizen soldier concept mean to the average American in the mid-19th century? Andrew Bledsoe's book, Citizen Officers, recently published by LSU Press, is a wonderful study of just this topic. And so books along those lines are really helping me flesh out how Shaw, who had no prior military experience, how he sort of adjusts to that military life and how he sort of tries to weed his way through promotion and maintaining the kinds of connections with his command that he needs to encourage those promotions.
So that is fascinating. That is absolutely fascinating. In many ways,
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead, please.
In many ways, it seems as if this biography that you're writing and the talk is really truly a microhistory in some ways, is a microhistory and this view into the officer class of the era.
Yeah,
and how they were
definitely.
dealing with those notions of manhood and masculinity and patriotism, and how they're attempting to rectify all of this. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think my talk is going to be really focused on that period before 1863, and focused on just the kinds of things that you're referencing. I would say one more area that has really sort of helped me think through the frame of this biography is the recent research on Reconstruction. I think a lot of Americans are interested in the history of Reconstruction. There's a new National Park Service site down in Beaufort, Port Royal, devoted exclusively to the history of Reconstruction. And in one sense, I think you can, certainly historians have understood the beginning of Reconstruction as beginning in 1863, that it's not a post-war moment, that it happens amidst the war itself. And specifically in places like the Seacoast Islands along the coast of South Carolina, where African Americans are flocking to, they're hoping for land, they're hoping to start their lives over, after the Union Navy and Army take control. And that's, of course, where Shaw and the 54th spend their last roughly 2 months, right? June, July. Well, before at least Shaw dies at Battery Wagner in mid-July of 63. And so trying to understand Shaw within the context of early Reconstruction, how do we understand what he's experiencing, along the Seacoast Islands? To what extent is Reconstruction shaping how he understands both his men, Black soldiers, and also, of course, the broader environment, right? This sort of shaping of Southern society. And so there's a lot of good recent literature on Reconstruction in that part of the South. And so I'm definitely using that to think through some questions about Shaw.
Fantastic. So is there, looking forward to the conference, most of the people who are watching this are getting excited about it. They're excited to hear you speak. Is there a particular episode in Shaw's life at any era, just an anecdote that you can give to them, get them excited, get them interested, get them even more interested?
Oh, now you're putting me on the spot, Wesley. I don't want to give too much away.
Oh, of course.
I am going to sort of frame this talk around what I think was the turning point in Shaw's military career. And I think most people, when they think of a turning point, they're probably thinking, well, it must have been the acceptance of the command of the 54th Massachusetts. But in my mind, it's his experience at Cedar Mountain in August of 1862. He sees a number of, he fights in a number of battles, takes part in a number of engagements in the Shenandoah Valley. But at Cedar Mountain in August of '62, it's probably the largest scale fight that he witnesses. And the result, I mean, his particular regiment loses a great deal of men in terms of the rank and file. But in terms of his fellow officers, it's a disaster. And it's this moment, and you can see it in Shaw's letters, where he never really sort of shows his emotion in his letters back home. But in a series of letters after Cedar Mountain, the war really comes home for him for the first time. He writes about walking over the battlefield, and certainly we have plenty of these letters from officers and enlisted men about the experience of walking over the battlefield, and seeing the scale of death, right? Shaw writes about one after the other coming across his friends. These are people that he bonded with as fellow officers. They shared a common culture. Many of them were from Harvard, as Shaw was. They were from the Boston area. They were the elite, as Shaw was. And he writes in a very poignant way about what it was like to, he describes in detail their faces. He describes packaging them in coffins for the transporting of them back to DC and eventually home, cutting locks of their hair. And I think this had a transformative effect on Shaw. I think in many ways, it's the first stage of that shift to becoming colonel. And what I mean by that is, I think the bonds that kept him in the Second Massachusetts are loosened enough as a result of, seeing his friends dead on the battlefield, losing the people that he counted on the most in camp, around the fire, that he's, I think, able, when the time comes, to consider accepting the offer from the governor of Massachusetts to take command of the 54th. So I hope that's enough of a teaser for people to attend the talk. Either way, I'm really looking forward to it. And I should say, I'm also looking forward to the tour that I'm giving with Professor Carmichael and Chris Gwynn. We're doing a battlefield tour that focuses specifically on camp slaves or body servants, slavery in the Army of Northern Virginia. So I'm also looking forward to that as well.
Certainly, I'm even more excited about your talk and tour now after that brief anecdote. Well, thank you for that.
It should
And
be
so,
awesome.
shifting slightly away from the conference and a little bit more onto you yourself as a scholar, you have an extensive online presence, and in a way that I feel it's appropriate to say it far surpasses most scholars in the present era of the American Civil War. I know I've followed your blog and followed you on Twitter extensively throughout my college career, and so certainly you're doing a great job of engaging with people of all ages. Where do you see the role of social media and online presence and whatnot in the future of history as we try to engage new people? And how much do you see it, sort of a loaded question, but how much do you see it grabbing the attention of new individuals versus just sort of being insular within the field?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for that. I wouldn't be where I am without social media. I don't have a PhD in history. I have a master's degree in history that I completed in 2005. And at that time, I didn't know what to do after that. I had this real, deep interest in Civil War history, specifically in historical memory or Civil War memory. And blogging had become, sort of popular at that time. And excuse me for one sec, sorry.
Not a problem.
And so I, not knowing anything about social media besides, say, perhaps Facebook, I jumped in and tried to figure out what can I do with this. And, it didn't take long before I was able to sort of bring together a pretty diverse group of, I guess, Civil War enthusiasts, even, scholars that I deeply respect. And that sort of blossomed into, opportunities to speak, write, and even publish. My first book was essentially my master's thesis, a revised master's thesis. So I've benefited, over the last close to 20 years now, because of social media. And, I guess what I find so interesting is that it's hard to predict where things are going. I think one of the nice things about where we are right now is that there is such a wide range of social media platforms. I mean, you think of the traditional blogging format. You've got Twitter, which you can harness for certain purposes, and then things like TikTok, right? Which a number of I'm not on TikTok, but a number of fellow historians are using it to great effect. And so that's one of the things I find really promising right now, that it's really about, finding the right platform. And I think also thinking through, I think this is the most important thing for people to consider before they jump on social media, to figure out what it is that you hope to accomplish. What is it that you want to do? Why are you using it to begin with? What are your pedagogical goals? If you can think in those terms. I'm a former high school teacher, so I'm always thinking, along those lines. And for me, I've stuck to sort of the blogging format. I mean, I've moved from a sort of a WordPress platform to Substack, which is more newslettery, but it still functions in that way. But I'm still able to I guess do what I need to do to stay connected with people and provide solid content, right? And I think, again, that's the thing you have to think through. There's a danger in jumping on social media simply for its own sake. I see way too many people who have been told by various authority figures that you need to be on social media. I hear people who, they're on social media because their publisher said, you need to be on there to promote your book. I hear people, who say, well, my advisor, graduate or undergraduate, will say, you need to be on social media. Now, I know that your advisor probably says the opposite. Stay as far away from social media as you can. And there is some value in that, right? I mean, that's actually good advice, because there are a wide range of experiences that people have on social media, and they're not all positive. And as much value as I see in it, I've sometimes, I think, been led astray in sort of how I utilize social media. But I think when I'm at my best, I am able to sort of find an audience, find people who share my passion, my deep interest in history, and find people that are willing to engage with me in a discussion. And again, I think you can do that on a number of platforms, as long as you're clear about why you're using it and how you're using it, right? I think those are the big questions to think through. So we'll see. It's hard to predict where we're going, but I see no end to it right now. But who knows? Who knows? It's hard to tell.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Levin, for speaking with me today.
My pleasure. Yeah.
Eagerly look forward to seeing you at this year's CWI conference. Hear more about that talk and the battlefield tour. Thank you again. Really appreciate it. Very excited.
Thanks, Wesley. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Of course.